All right. I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. My name is Erin Pope, and I am a junior at Marian University studying secondary special education with minors in psychology and writing. I'm also actively involved on campus as president of our Union for Black Identity and involved in the Office of Residential and Commuter Life, what a mouthful, as an RA. So it is my privilege to moderate just a little brief question and answer with our filmmaker, Martin Doblmeier of Revolution of Heart. So as a little bit of background, Martin holds degrees in religious studies, broadcast journalism, and honorary degrees in fine arts and humane letters. He's also the founder of Journey Films and has produced and directed more than 30 films focused on religion, faith, and spirituality. We welcome you, Martin.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So I'm going to start by asking a few questions. And while I'm doing so, folks tuned in virtually, of course, can submit questions at the bottom in the Ask a Question little feature at the bottom, or you could also put them in the chat. I'll try to work those in at the end if we have enough time after I ask a few of my questions. So to begin, we'd like to connect Spirit and Place's origins theme of this year's festival by asking you, what is your origin story, Martin? What drives you to make films focused on faith and spirituality, and what specifically attracted you to Dorothy Day in particular?
Well, those are all great questions. I wanted to start off by saying thanks particularly to the Lilly Endowment. It was originally scheduled that I'd be out there in Indianapolis to do the screening of the events, to do it live and be with everybody out there, and to thank publicly the endowment for all the support it's given us over the years. And I know it's a support for the Spirit in Place. But you saw at the beginning of the film that it's one of the key reasons why we were able to make the film. And I wanted to say thanks to everyone at the endowment for that. For my own origin, well, last name Doblmeier is a German last name. My grandparents came over from Germany in right at the turn of the beginning of the 1900s. And I think out of my father, I got a sort of like a systematic, sort of legalistic appreciation for research and sort of principles. Very Catholic background he had. And then on my mother's side, which is all Irish, it's the storytelling notion. And I've been to County Cork, where my family comes from in Ireland. My mother's family comes from in Ireland, all great storytellers. So it's the combination of wanting to tell stories and the sort of the research in the background that comes together, that sort of fuses together in me. And that's why I've been making these films. This, like you said, the Dorothy Day film, I think, is number 35. We've made now 35 films on religion and faith and spirituality. And it's just, I feel very lucky. I feel that I majored in religious studies, and this is something I've always felt as though I wanted to do throughout my life. So I feel very blessed that I was able to do that and to find my groove and to be able to do something that really is part of, really sort of fundamental to who I am. And for me, I got onto Dorothy Day, it was in the 1970s. So I was very young and she was very old. She was beginning to retire. But I was a writer at a Catholic newspaper. And so I was keeping up with her work all the time and learning about her. And she was always in the back of my mind that I would eventually someday do a documentary film about Dorothy Day. And this film on Dorothy Day, Revolution of the Heart, is one of a series that we're doing on what we call prophetic voices of the 20th century. And so that included Howard Thurman, Reinhold Niebuhr, and the next film, the last film in the series, will be on the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And so for me, I see these people not as biographies of people in the past, in the distant past, but as people that I believe really have so much to say to us today, and how we want to think about how we want to engage God and how we want to be present in the world around us.
So, well, my next question, I think you already answered it. When were you first introduced to Dorothy Day?
Well, again, I was writing at a Catholic newspaper. I was a very young journalist and trying to follow and keep up with what was happening in the country. And I was really moved, I think, by her conviction to pacifism. And she was uncompromising. And for me, from day one, when I encountered Dorothy Day, I thought in many ways she set the bar. You know, she says in the very beginning of this film, she says, you can read the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and you see it as like lovely literature, lovely language, but are you willing to take it as far as it really asks you to go? That's the fundamental question. And for me, that's what I hope people will take out of the film. She becomes the person who asks us, how far are you willing to go with all of this? And that's what I think is the single most important message that comes out of her story. I also wanted to add, too, that there's two updates that I can give folks about this storyline. First of all, you saw in the film Martha Hennessy, the granddaughter, one of 9 grandchildren of Dorothy Day. And Martha Hennessy has followed in her grandmother's footsteps. And she became part of a group called the Plowsharers 7, that on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., they went down to Kings Bay, Georgia, to the Trident missile base, broke in, and made a public demonstration against the nuclear weapons as a way to demonstrate what she thinks is the immorality of nuclear weapons. The same thing that the Pope recently came out and said publicly when he made his trip to Japan, that the weapons themselves are wrong, they're immoral. And Martha Hennessy and 6 others were arrested. And over the course of the last 2+ years, they've been convicted on 4 counts, 3 felonies and a misdemeanor, conspiracy, breaking in, destruction of federal property. And today, just today, Martha has been sentenced. I haven't been able, I've been on my phone and trying to sort of see if I can get the news as quickly as possible. But all the other 6 people involved in the action were all sentenced already, getting on average between 1 and 2 years behind bars. And Martha was being sentenced today, so I haven't heard what happened to Martha Hennessy, but Martha's in her 60s. She's a grandmother. Most of these people who were arrested, who made this demonstration, are 55 and over, up to 80 years old, and they're facing some serious jail time for their living out their convictions to try and bring the attention to what they believe is the immorality of nuclear weapons. So as soon as we finish with this conversation, I'm going to jump on the phone and see if I can get an update on what's happening to Martha Hennessy. But the group is called the Plowsharers 7. And the other thing that's happened since the making of the film is that Dorothy Day had, as we said in the film, been categorized in the Catholic Church as a servant of God. That's the first step towards sainthood. And now they've actually completed the collecting of all the documentation to advance her case, and it's all being sent now to Rome. So there's really there's a lot of hope and excitement about the possibility of her moving to the second phase of the canonization process. So that there may be news about that. You know, in the past, being canonized as saint could take 100 years, hundreds of years even. But now we're getting more accustomed to the fact that a canonization can happen. Somebody can be declared a saint within our lifetime. John Paul II and Mother Teresa, all people that I actually knew. I had actually encountered and met them. And they're all now declared saints. So I'm not going to be surprised if Dorothy Day is declared a saint in the next couple of years.
Wow, that is super exciting. Definitely something to look forward to. Amidst everything that's going on right now, at least we know that Dorothy Day might become a saint. Something to definitely look forward to. How was this process for you, and what were some of the successes and challenges in creating this film?
Well, we've been through this routine a lot. You know, we made, like I said, 30 films or so. And so we have a wonderful core group of people that I work with. People have specialties in all different areas in research with me, who work with me in the research, and editors and sound technicians, camera people. So we have a team together that's just a terrific team. One of the hardest challenges is, you know, as I'm interviewing people, all the research that goes into it. I guess that's kind of my father's side, all the study and the research and everything. But we did all these interviews with people, and I think actually the hardest challenge always is how can you tell this woman's story in a period of time that will do 2 things. Number one, it will engage an audience that doesn't know a lot about Dorothy Day, maybe nothing at all about her. Maybe they'll just come upon the film watching public television, and you know, sort of hopefully you have to be able to hook them into the show. And then the second thing is there are a lot of people who do know Dorothy Day, and you want to be able to provide them with a sense that they're going to learn new things, understand her in a different way, hear other voices that they may not have heard commenting about Dorothy Day. So we tried to bring in a bunch of different voices. I thought Martin Sheen's addition to the film was really personal. I thought Cornel West was really one of the best voices in the film. So we have the granddaughters in the film speaking, but I think sort of bringing the mixture of voices into the film to sort of round out the understanding of who she was and the impact that she's had on so many different people's lives.
That was a really good bridge to a question from our audience. How did Martin Sheen get involved, and how cool was it to interview him?
Well, Martin Sheen is he's a devoted pacifist. I mean, he's involved with all of this. I don't know if you also, if anybody picked it up. I also had another radical who read for the voice of Dorothy Day. Susan Sarandon was the woman's voice who read for the character from the writings of Dorothy Day that I was able to pull together. And Martin Sheen is he's very committed to this work. He's a believer in the Catholic worker movement. He actually went down to Georgia for one of the hearings when the Plowsharers 7. He actually went from California to Georgia to be in the courtroom when the Plowsharers 7 were making their statements and they're testifying. So he was pretty committed to all this from the beginning. And I asked him if he wanted to do it, and he was quite willing to do it. And he had a very personal story. He was truly a struggling actor in the 1950s and stumbled upon the Catholic Worker House in New York. Didn't really know anything about it, but was so grateful for the care that he received and the dignity with which he was treated that he was more than happy to do this and stand up for it. And Susan Sarandon, the same way, she said, look, I really respected who this person was, Dorothy Day, and what she did. So she's now become these have all become new friends now to our world, our universe of Journey Films, and we're grateful for that.
We have another question from the audience. Was winnowing down a serious challenge with all the wonderful, vigorous, and cogent interviewees that you had?
Well, that's always part of the trouble, having to bring it down and put it into an order of a film. Part of my process is to know exactly what I'm looking for when I go into the interviews and sit down with these people, and so that I already have arced out in my own mind a storyline that I'm going to try to get to, and I have to be open to the different things that'll happen, the surprises that'll happen along the way. But I better have a good outline of what I'm trying to get to even before I sit down and start to talk to people in the film. One of the things that we do is we also make a lot more of the interviews available to people on our website. If you go to journeyfilms.com, there's all kinds of educational material about the film, and it contains a lot more of the elements of the interviews that I did with everybody. So there's actually more behind the scenes going on with the film that we're able to actually put into the film. But hopefully the film will introduce Dorothy Day to literally millions and millions of people.
Another great bridge for a question that I have. Do you feel like the Dorothy Day story is well known? And if not, how can we make that so?
Well, hopefully the film will bring millions of new admirers to the Dorothy Day story. I don't know. I'm surprised sometimes about how many people don't know who Dorothy Day is, and I'm not kidding when I tell you that there have been many occasions over these last couple of years in the process of making the film where I would say Dorothy Day and they would say Doris Day. No, I would say not Doris Day, Dorothy Day, a totally different character. So it's really quite interesting to see how her name is not known, but for everybody who does know the name of Dorothy Day, I think she holds a special place in their heart, and certainly they can look at her as their spiritual GPS. Joan Chittister in the film talks about how Peter Morin becomes Dorothy Day's spiritual GPS. But I think the reality is now that I think Dorothy Day is more than capable of acting and behaving and becoming a spiritual GPS for so many of us. She becomes the litmus test for how we're living our lives, and if we're living our lives in accordance with the Gospels. That's what I think is the most important thing.
What other figures are you interested in documenting?
Well, the next film that we just finished it. It's all done, and it's being released to public television now, and it'll broadcast in the beginning of 2021. is a film on, I think, the great Jewish voice in the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he too, like Dorothy Day and Howard Thurman and Reinhold Niebuhr, I think these are the great prophetic voices of the last century, people that we need to study, think about more, and hold on to, because I think they can say a lot to us in our particular times. It's really interesting and sad that a lot of the questions that they're struggling with, they were struggling with in their time, have still not been resolved yet. I mean, Dorothy Day is a case in point. I mean, she was the person who was out there campaigning against nuclear weapons. They haven't gone away. She's talking about the poor. The poor in America the numbers continue to grow. Now with the coronavirus epidemic that's happening, a pandemic that's happening in the country, we're going to have more poor people than ever before. And so the need for America to understand its obligation to care for the least among us is going to get more and more important. I think Dorothy Day becomes a shining light, a beacon for all of us now in the midst of all of that.
Martin, this is Taylor, sorry, but somebody in the comments said that they heard that Martha Hennessy got 10 months in prison.
I
wanted to let you know that.
That's, it's less than she could have gotten, certainly. And so in that way, I'm sure she's grateful. But 10 months, she's in her 60s. There's a COVID pandemic that's happening all across this country. For her to actually serve 10 months in a prison is a dangerous thing. I love Martha. She is really, you see Martha Hennessy and you see a reflection of her grandmother. And to hear that she got 10 months it's really tragic. The judge did seem to be understanding, but not particularly open to compromising. So it's going to be, I suffer hearing that from Martha Hennessy. She's really a great woman, and I just can't imagine what she must be going like now, her and her family, knowing that she's going off to prison for 10 months for making a statement that she believed was important to be made.
Would you be interested in doing a film to follow up with some of those people that did get that prison sentence due to their choice?
Well, I'm not sure if there'd be a whole film for us. We'd have to think about that. That's a good question, Erin. But certainly we're staying in touch with folks, and I've been with them, together with them at different points, and I'll take a look at that. I'll see what's happening with them. But I just want to say, as much as I feel, I actually felt a physical moment when I heard that she got 10 months in prison, just to know that she's going in there. Isn't it interesting how all some of the great religious figures all wind up spending time in jail, whether it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Martin Luther King Jr., yeah. St. Paul. I mean, it's almost inevitable that if you're going to make a stand, if you're going to stand on what it is you believe in, if your faith calls you to actually be public about that, you can wind up being in tension with the civil authorities, and that's exactly what's happened now to Martha Hennessy.
So we have another question from our audience asking, were LGBTQ plus concerns important for Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement?
The Catholic worker movement is a nationwide movement, and yes, that is on the agenda for some of the Catholic worker houses around the country. I said in the film that there's about 200 Catholic worker houses nationwide around America now, which is really quite remarkable. 30 of them were there when she passed away, Dorothy Day, and now 200. It doesn't come up much at all in her literature, in her writings, in her autobiographies or anything, but certainly the movement itself in different places around the country are talking about the LGBTQ issues. And again, I wanted to remind people that this month, November, it's the 40th anniversary of Dorothy Day's passing. She died in 1980. And so there are different webinars and celebrations about her life. So it's already 40 years since her passing. I see there's a note here. It says the Berrigans would make a good story. Indeed, they would. The Berrigan brothers would.
Mother, FaceTime video.
Getting a FaceTime call decline. What is the most difficult part of documentary filmmaking?
Besides raising the funding, that's number one. It's always it's really not easy to raise the funding. That's where it starts for all of us to be able to make them. I tell my friends who are writers, book writers, that it doesn't cost you a lot to sit in your bedroom and spend your days writing a book. But once you start putting crews on the road, traveling, all the editing, all the equipment, all the technology that's so important to do it, it's an expensive process making these films. And so that's the challenging thing. There's no challenge, Erin, to find good ideas. We're always getting people. I have people literally knocking on my door who want to come and visit Journey Films and tell me an idea about that they have to make a film. Oftentimes, interestingly enough, it's about them. but in fact, there's no shortage of ideas. Lots of great ideas. The challenge is the funding, but we want to be true to what we think we are. Our mission, our purpose at Journey Films is to tell stories that we think are important in the world of religion, faith, and spirituality. And there are still lots of stories. I'm exploring the possibility of doing a film now on James Cone, the great theologian who just passed away. He was he was an inspiration for me, and I think not only for in the world of Black theology, but I think for theology in general. So we're looking at a bunch of different ideas that can be both biographical films and also thematic films.
Erin asks a question. She says, I loved A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Skolnick, who argues experiencing the San Francisco earthquake greatly shaped Dorothy Day, particularly the idea that neighbors have the power to save themselves. Do you agree about the earthquake's impact?
Yeah, that was one of the things I really did want to include in the film. It was quite remarkable. There actually was film footage of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. We were able to find that. Acquired from the San Francisco Public Archives, and she writes about this in her autobiography. Her autobiography is called The Long Loneliness, and she talks in detail about the impact that it had. 9 years old, and to see all the devastation. 3,000 people died in the San Francisco earthquake, but almost 500,000 people were left homeless or desperate, and she watched as neighbor helped neighbor. And I think that was the beginning, the origins, the genesis for her of trying to understand how things can actually, good can come out of evil, good can come out of tragedy, because one person is willing to help another. And this whole notion of personalism, that I have a personal responsibility when I see you and I see that you're hurting and you're in need, I have a personal responsibility to do something. And I think that you can trace back some of that thinking, that mindset, to what happened to her in San Francisco. I think it's one of the most important gifts that she leaves us, is this notion of personalism, that don't wait for the federal government to step up. Don't send people to a municipal or a city site. Actually, it's up to us to take care of the people who are hurting in front of us. And so in that way, you want to call her, she's progressive in the sense that she's actually out there talking about what people would normally call progressive issues. But she is actually calling for a program that would minimize government to its smallest role in people's lives. Right. So that's a really interesting part of the balance of Dorothy Day. She's both sides of that coin. She wants a micro government, and she sees that a lot of the responsibility of caring for each other can be picked up by us as individuals.
So we have time for a few more questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Ask those questions in the chat box.
I see a note here. It says Joan Chittister would make a fabulous pope. I agree. I
have another one. What is the largest takeaway that you want us to have adopted from the film?
Oh, there's a lot about Dorothy Day, and I hesitate to say one. What I find really interesting is you have on one side of Dorothy Day a social progressive. She wants to go out and change the world. She identifies the evils. She writes about them. She attacks them. But on the other side, you have this really conservative, traditional, pious woman. 2-3 hours of prayer a day. So for her, it wasn't just radicalism, social radicalism. It was also this sort of deepening, a daily deepening of her spiritual self. And that, I think, is a huge context. We have a lot of social radicalism going on in America, but is there the spiritual depth to it? She wanted to bring those two things together. She thought that was absolutely important to be able to do that. And one sort of feeds off the other. One's not only possible because of the other. And the whole notion of study. Dorothy Day never stopped her spiritual journey. She was constantly reading about the lives of the saints, trying to understand how they could impact her own life. So she never stopped being a student of her own theology and spiritual development. And I think that's a great lesson for all of us.
What's next for you? What are some other projects that you're working on or plan to work on in the future?
Well, I'm doing this film on Abraham Heschel, and that's just about finished right now. So I'll devote most of the beginning of next year to getting that released and getting as many people to come to that film. I think Abraham Heschel, if you have time, if the viewers want to take a look at him and his life, he is really a wonderful example of an extraordinary religious character who became an important voice. His connection to Martin Luther King Jr., the friendship, the brotherhood between he and Martin Luther King Jr. is absolutely one of the great stories in recent American history. So I'm excited about releasing that film too, getting interest going on that film. And then at some point soon, we're going to couple all the films together, Dorothy Day, Howard Thurman, Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Heschel, into the series that we think is going to be an important series for people, especially in theological settings, to look at prophetic voices in the 20th century and how they can impact and speak to us, continue to speak to us today. And more importantly, how can we train from a theological point of view? How can we train and think about preparing people to be the new prophetic voices in our time? That's, I think, what's the most important lesson and takeaway from all of this.
Mm-hmm. What is it about the faith community that interests you as a filmmaker?
Well, I've done, like I said, 30 some films. The first few films that I did were about faith communities. I went to Europe quite a bit. I spent time at L'Arche with Jean Vanier and the L'Arche community for men and women with mental handicaps, the Taizé community, the ecumenical community of Taizé, and the community of Corrymeela in Northern Ireland, all three very unique communities. And I think that's part of the attraction to me too for the Dorothy Day story, because she wasn't a lone, patriot out there doing her job. Her real intention was to create community, and to be able to, and now you see, and having created community, what is left over now 40 years after she's passed. She's left behind this community called the Catholic Worker Movement, the Catholic Worker Communities, which now have 200 houses all across the country and have spawned thousands of different kind of enterprises and ways to help people. So the whole notion of Christian community is really coming out of Dorothy Day's, one of the most important parts of Dorothy Day's legacy. You have a Catholic Worker house in Indianapolis. The House of the Little Flower, named after Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was one of the saints that Dorothy Day loved and studied and modeled herself after. And I spoke to the folks at the House of the Little Flower, and they have residence for 7 people. They're involved in the local issues in their own in Indianapolis. So I encourage the people in Indianapolis to connect with them and find out what's going on and see. But these are all the communities that have spawned out of the work that Dorothy Day began.
Finally, what was Dorothy Day's major source of funds?
Oh, well, that's a really interesting question. Dorothy Day decided early on that she was going to live, as we would say, hand to mouth, that she was not going to set up the Catholic worker houses as tax-exempt 501c3s so that nobody could give tax deductions and take give a gift and take a tax deduction. How crazy is that? I know in our modern thinking that we would never do that, but that is exactly what she did. But she lived off the generosity of others, and that's what she believed Christ was calling her to do. And so she becomes a very different model for how to structure a sustainability. They didn't need much. But everything that they had, everything they received was all given out of the goodness of somebody else's bounty. And it's a really interesting model for us.
Well, Martin, with that, we would like to thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Spirit in Place Festival. To everyone still watching, we thank you for tuning in and sharing this evening with us. Please remember, I think the link is in the chat. We want to encourage you to take that survey so we can have some of your feedback and we can apply it to next year's festival. Thank you all. Stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your evening.